Welcome back, everybody. We've got a lot to get to today, so let's jump right in.
Yeah, no shortage of headlines, that's for sure.
All right, well, first up, that whole situation in Ukraine, wow. It seems like President Zelensky's trip to the White House, it was supposed to be about, like, getting more support, maybe even signing that mineral deal. But, well, it kind of blew up in everyone's faces.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really sugarcoat it. That Oval Office meeting between Trump and Zelensky, I mean, wow, it just went completely off the rails. You had accusations flying around about Zelensky being ungrateful for U.S. aid, and even like almost casual talk about World War III.
And Zelensky, well, he didn't just sit there and take it. He pushed back hard against, the idea of compromising with Putin. He even brought up that ceasefire deal from 2019, the one that totally fell apart.
Yeah, and his point, it makes sense, right? Like, appeasing Putin just doesn't work. He's been super clear about that. And what's really interesting is how the rest of the world is reacting. I mean, you've got Macron, Merz, even Pallas from Estonia, all coming out strong in support of Zelensky. And then on the other side, you've got Russia. Russia praising Trump and Vance for their restraint.
It's all so just messy and complicated.
Totally.
Well, okay, let's move on to something a little closer to home. This story has really been making the rounds. Gene Hackman and his wife, Betsy Arakawa, have died.
Yeah, and it's a really strange situation full of mystery. The maintenance workers, the ones who found them at their home in New Mexico, they said they rarely ever saw the couple. Apparently, they mostly just communicated through phone calls and texts.
So very private people, it seems.
Yeah, it seems that way. And here's where it gets even weirder. So Arakawa's body, it was already decomposing when they found her. They even said there were signs of mummification. But Hackman's pacemaker, that last registered activity on February 17th.
Wow. Okay, so that's what, like a 2-week gap at
Yeah.
least? So they're saying the deaths are suspicious, but so far, no signs of foul play.
Right, no signs of foul play. Carbon monoxide poisoning is out. But they did find prescription pills and a portable heater near Arakawa's body. So lots of questions. They're still waiting on the autopsy and toxicology reports.
And in the meantime, Hackman's daughter is saying, that he was in great shape and that they had a really loving marriage. It's all just very sad and very mysterious.
Yeah.
Now, to a story that's causing a lot of anger and confusion. The Adriana migrant boat sinking. There's been a leak, some audio recordings that seem to contradict the official story from Greece about what happened.
Yeah, these recordings, they seem to suggest that Greek rescue coordinators might have actually told the captain of the migrant boat to tell other ships, like the ones coming to help, that they didn't want to go to Greece. I mean, if that's true, it could have seriously hindered any rescue attempts. And it gets worse. Some of the survivors, they're saying the Coast Guard caused the boat to capsize, and then they pressured witnesses to keep quiet.
Greece, of course, is denying everything, saying they acted appropriately and that they've given all the evidence to a naval court, the one that's investigating the sinking. But still, I mean, this audio, it definitely raises a lot of questions.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, let's shift gears now. The Taliban, they've just unveiled this, well, it's huge, a massive new surveillance system. Apparently, there are 90,000 CCTV cameras all over Kabul.
They're saying it's all about security, about reducing crime. But, come on, you have to wonder how this technology is really going to be used. We're seeing footage of the police watching the city in real time. They can track license plates, faces, any public gatherings. It's a level of surveillance that's pretty unsettling, to say the least.
Right, and especially when you consider the Taliban's history.
Yeah.
And that there are basically no laws in place to protect people's data. It seems like this technology could very easily be used to enforce their strict moral code and to target anyone who speaks out against them.
Yeah, it's a pretty scary thought.
And then on top of all that, ordinary Afghans are actually having to pay for the installation of these cameras. It's like another burden on people who are already struggling so much.
Yeah, that's pretty messed up.
Okay, well, here's a story that's making a lot of noise. Andrew and Tristan Tate, they're back in the U.S. Their travel restrictions in Romania were lifted.
Yeah, and this is despite all the legal trouble they're still facing there. I mean, they're accused of some serious stuff. Rape, human trafficking, money laundering. They say they're innocent, of course, that it's all just a big conspiracy against them. But a lot of people are questioning how they were able to get those restrictions lifted.
Especially with those reports that White House officials have been taking an interest in their case. It's leading to a lot of speculation about U.S. influence and just, the power of that whole manosphere thing, the one the Tates are so closely associated with.
It's a really polarizing situation. You've got people celebrating their release, and then you've got others, including some of the alleged victims, who are deeply, deeply concerned. It feels like this is just the beginning of a whole new chapter in the take story.
One that's probably going to be pretty wild.
I think that's a safe bet.
All right, let's run through a few other big headlines from around the world, kind of a lightning round.
Okay, sounds good.
In Greece, there have been mass protests after that deadly train crash. People are demanding justice. They're blaming the government for not investing enough in rail safety. The prime minister, he even admitted that there were fatal human errors and chronic shortcomings of the state. But people are angry.
Yeah, I can't say I blame them.
In Pakistan, there was a horrific explosion at a seminary. They actually call it the University of Jihad. It killed 6 people, including the son of a prominent cleric. It's a very delicate situation because this seminary has ties to the Afghan Taliban.
Right. And so far, no one has claimed responsibility. We'll have to see how this unfolds.
Pope Francis, well, he's dealing with more health problems. The Vatican is saying he had a respiratory crisis. He was vomiting and had to be put on a ventilator, a non-invasive one at least. This is all happening after those reports that he was doing better after that bout with pneumonia. People are worried. And in the world of film, an acclaimed Japanese Me Too movie, it's facing all sorts of controversy. It was even considered a potential Oscar nominee, but it hasn't been released in Japan because of these legal challenges around the footage they used.
It's kind of a microcosm of the broader issue, isn't it? Even when you're trying to make art that tackles these really important social issues, it can be so difficult to get your message out there, especially when you're going up against powerful people and deeply ingrained cultural norms.
It's a fight.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, well, we also got word about a major train fire in the Czech Republic. The train was carrying benzene, which, it's highly toxic. They had to evacuate people. There are a lot of concerns about the air quality, about the potential health risks.
And on a related note, there's been this global operation. They were targeting AI-generated child abuse images, and it actually led to a bunch of arrests. It's scary to think that this technology is being used for such horrific things, but, it also shows that law enforcement is taking this seriously, that they're working to stay ahead of the curve.
It's a constant battle, isn't it? Trying to keep up with the dark side of technology.
Unfortunately, yes. And speaking of technology and its consequences, we've got news about NOAA, the U.S. Climate Agency. They've laid off hundreds of employees. This is part of Elon Musk's, what he calls a streamlining effort under the Department of Government Efficiency. But people are worried. They're saying these cuts are going to hurt vital environmental research and programs.
It's all about the bottom line, I guess. Which, speaking of, there's this story about a Japanese woman who's under investigation in South Korea. She kissed Jin, who's a member of the K-pop group BTS, at a fan event. And it sparked a whole conversation about, how fans should behave, about boundaries, and about those sometimes intense relationships between fans and celebrities.
Right. Where do you draw the line? It's an interesting debate, for sure.
Okay, before we go to break, just a couple more quick hits. Mexico has extradited 29 people. They're suspected members of drug cartels to the U.S. And this includes Rafael Caro Quintero, who, is a pretty notorious drug lord, so that's a big deal for U.S.-Mexico relations and for the fight against drug trafficking.
Absolutely. And in other news, Katy Perry is going to be a part of an all-female spaceflight on Blue Origin's New Shepard rocket. So that's pretty cool. It's great to see more women breaking barriers and getting involved in space exploration.
Right, it's a big deal for sure. Now, for a story out of New Zealand, their highest court has overturned a ruling clearing a company responsibility for that deadly volcano eruption on White Island back in 2019. And this has really stirred things up. People are talking about accountability, about tourist safety.
It's a tough one. How do you balance, the risks of exploring these amazing natural wonders with the need to keep people safe? Who's ultimately responsible when something goes wrong?
It's a big question, one without any easy answers. And while we're on the topic of natural disasters, there's been a massive avalanche in the Himalayas. It's trapped a bunch of road workers. The rescue efforts are really difficult because the weather is so bad.
It's a race against time.
Absolutely. All right, we need to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more news from around the globe.
And we're back. Before we move on, I think it's worth taking a closer look at that whole Trump-Zelensky thing. It wasn't just like a personality clash or whatever. I mean, it really showed how differently they see the world, America's role in it, all of that.
It felt like more than just a disagreement, right? Like two totally different ways of thinking. You've got Trump, the deal maker, wanting to, get concessions, wrap things up quickly, and maybe maybe he's thinking about a future deal with Russia.
Exactly. And on the other side, you've got Zelensky. I mean, this guy, he's been thrown into this wartime leadership role, and he's fiercely defending his country's right to exist. He's become like a symbol of standing up to bullies, to authoritarianism. He won't compromise on, what he sees as these core principles.
It's almost like a classic David and Goliath story, right?
Right.
But with like insanely high stakes, not just for Ukraine, but for like the whole global order.
For sure. And the thing is, Trump's approach, I mean, putting his own interests first,
Yeah.
this transactional diplomacy thing, it undermines the whole idea of international alliances, of the rule of law. So it makes sense that so many world leaders are, lining up behind Zelensky and expressing real concern about where U.S. foreign policy is headed.
Right? Like Macron and Merz, they're basically saying enough is enough. They're standing with Ukraine. They're reaffirming their commitment to democracy.
Hmm.
And it feels like, this could be a turning point for the relationship between the U.S. and Europe.
Yeah, potentially. Okay, so let's switch gears a bit. Back to that story about Gene Hackman and his wife. It's natural that people want answers, right?
Yeah,
Especially
versus-
because, well, they were famous and the authorities haven't really said much. But we have to be careful about jumping to conclusions. We have to let the investigation run its course.
Right, right. Easier said than done, though, with all the media frenzy and speculation. So as things move forward, what are some of the key things we should be looking out for?
Well, the toxicology reports, those are going to be crucial. Those will tell us if drugs or other substances were involved. And of course, the full autopsy findings, those will give us a clearer picture of how they died, the cause and manner of death.
And the timeline, right? That seems to be a big question mark. We know Hackman's pacemaker stopped on February 17th, but we don't know when his wife died.
Yeah, figuring out the exact timeline and also looking at any communication they had in the days leading up to their deaths, that could be really helpful. But for now, all we can do is wait. Hopefully those reports will shed some light on this whole thing. It's just so sad and so strange.
It really is. Okay, let's talk about that migrant boat sinking, the Adriana. Those leaked audio recordings, I mean, wow, they're disturbing. The things they're saying about the Greek Coast Guard, it's serious stuff.
Yeah. If those recordings are real, it paints a really dark picture. Like they didn't even care about those people's lives. And then you've got the survivors saying they caused the boat to capsize and that they tried to cover it all up.
And Greece is sticking to their story. They're saying they did everything by the book and that they've handed over all the evidence to the naval court that's doing the investigation.
Right. But those recordings, they're a problem for their version of events.
Big time. This could turn into a huge international scandal. It could really hurt Greece's reputation. They need to be transparent. They need to be accountable, not just for the families of the victims, but for the whole world to see.
Totally agree. And I think this tragedy also brings up the bigger issue, right? The humanitarian crisis in the Mediterranean. I mean, these migrants, they're making these desperate journeys, risking their lives to find safety, and then so often they're met with this callous, inhumane response. It's a reminder that we need to be doing more, that we need to work together to address the root causes of this crisis.
100%. Okay, so the Taliban and their new surveillance system, it's just, I don't know, it's creepy seeing those images of the police watching everything, everyone, all the time.
Yeah, it's like something out of a dystopian novel, right? And the thing is, with no real data protection laws and with the Taliban's track record, it creates this atmosphere of fear. Like anyone who disagrees with them, who speaks out, they can be found, they can be silenced. This isn't just surveillance, it's control.
Total control. And then, to make things even worse, they're making ordinary Afghans pay for these cameras. I mean, come on, those people are already going through so much.
Yeah, it's exploitation, plain and simple.
All right, so Andrew and Tristan Tate, they're back in the U.S., and it seems like everyone has an opinion about it. It's kind of wild how this case has become this, I don't know, this cultural flashpoint.
It's like they've tapped into something, right? This whole masculinity thing. Wealth, women, they're heroes to some, villains to others. And now, with these serious accusations against them, it's all just gotten more intense.
And the fact that they got their travel restrictions lifted in Romania, even with the legal battles they're still facing there, it's raising a lot of eyebrows. Some people are saying it shows how much power and influence they have. Others are saying it's proof they're getting away with something.
And then you add in the reports about White House officials taking an interest in their case.
Right. It just fuels the conspiracy theories.
Yeah, it makes it look like maybe there was some political pressure involved in getting them released, which, considering the accusations against them, that's not a good look. I mean, these guys, their whole brand is built on this kind of like aggressive masculinity, this idea that women are, less than, and their alleged actions, well, they seem to line up with that worldview.
It's a mess. It's a really unsettling situation.
Right.
And it brings up all these questions about online fame, about how harmful ideas spread, and about whether powerful people are ever truly held accountable.
For sure.
So those protests in Greece, the ones after the train crash, I mean, it's not just about the crash itself, right? It's about something bigger.
It's about people feeling like the system is broken, that no one's listening to them, that those in power aren't being held responsible. The crash, it was like this breaking point, this moment where people said, we've had enough.
Yeah, it feels like a real loss of faith in the government.
For sure. And speaking of volatile situations, that explosion at the University of Jihad in Pakistan, it's a scary reminder that terrorism is still a very real threat. And the fact that this seminary is connected to the Afghan Taliban just makes things even more complicated.
Yeah, it's a tangled web, for sure. And there's still so much we don't know about who's behind the attack, what their motives were.
Right. We'll have to wait and see what the investigation turns up.
So Pope Francis, more health issues. That respiratory crisis, it's a worry. He's not a young man, and it seems like the weight of, leading the Catholic Church is taking a toll.
And he's been such a transformative figure, hasn't he? His focus on social justice, on dialogue between different religions, on protecting the environment.
A lot of people would say the world needs him right now.
Yeah. Let's hope he makes a full recovery. Okay, so that Japanese Me Too film, the one that's been censored in its own country, it's a really interesting case. I mean, it shows how hard it can be to challenge the status quo, even in a place that's seen as progressive.
Right. Even when you're talking about something as serious as sexual abuse,
Yeah.
as holding powerful people accountable, you're going to face pushback.
Yeah.
It shows how deeply entrenched these power structures are, how resistant to change.
Yeah, it's a tough battle. Now, that train fire in the Czech Republic with all that benzene, that's a serious environmental hazard. The health risks for people who are exposed, those could be significant.
Absolutely. And speaking of, scary situations, there was this global operation targeting AI-generated child abuse images. They actually made a bunch of arrests. It's horrifying to think that this technology is being used for such awful things, but at least it shows that law enforcement is taking this seriously, that they're trying to stay ahead of the bad guys.
It's a constant game of cat and mouse, right? Technology, it can be used for such good, but also for such evil.
Speaking of which, those layoffs at NOAA, the climate agency, they're really concerning. I mean, yeah, maybe there's some waste that needs to be cut, but a lot of people are saying these layouts are going to gut vital programs, that it's going to hurt our ability to understand and address climate change.
Right. Some would say it's short-sighted, that we're jeopardizing our future to save a few bucks in the present.
It's a tough balance for sure. Okay, now for a story that's a little lighter, but still interesting. That Japanese woman who kissed Jin from BTS, it sparked this whole conversation about fandom, about boundaries, about the relationship between fans and celebrities.
It's a tricky one, right? Because fandom can be so powerful, so intense, but there have to be limits. Everyone deserves to feel safe and respected.
Absolutely. So some positive news on the international cooperation front. Mexico extradited 29 suspected drug cartel members to the U.S.
Including Rafael Caro Quintero, who's, a pretty big deal in the drug trafficking world.
Yeah, so that's a significant win for the U.S. and for Mexico. It shows they're serious about working together to crack down on these criminal organizations.
For sure. Now, this is cool. Katy Perry is going to be on an all-female spaceflight with Blue Origin.
That's awesome.
Right. It's a huge step forward for women in space exploration.
Yeah, it's inspiring to see more women breaking those barriers, showing what's possible.
Totally agree. Okay, back down to Earth now. New Zealand's highest court, they just made a pretty controversial decision. They overturned a ruling clearing a company of responsibility for that volcano eruption on White Island back in 2019.
Yeah, that one was tragic. A lot of people died. And now this decision, it sparked all these arguments about, who's accountable, how we keep tourists safe.
It's a tough one. How much risk is acceptable when you're dealing with nature? Who's ultimately responsible when something goes wrong?
It's a conversation we need to be having, especially as more and more people are, venturing out to these amazing but potentially dangerous places.
Yeah, no easy answers there.
So sadly, there's been another natural disaster. A massive avalanche in the Himalayas. It's trapped a bunch of road workers, and the rescue efforts are being hampered by really bad
It's
weather.
just our after a situation. Those rescuers, they're incredibly brave, putting their own lives at risk to try to save others.
It's race against time, that's for sure. Okay, so this is a story that Well, it's about taking responsibility, about learning from mistakes. The Israeli Defense Forces, they've admitted that they failed to protect civilians during that Hamas attack back in 2024.
That's a big deal. For them to acknowledge their failures, to say, we messed up, that's not easy. But it's an important step. It's about accountability, and it's about trying to prevent something like that from happening again.
And their report, it talks about, intelligence failures, operational shortcomings, just a general lack of preparedness.
It's a reminder that even the most sophisticated militaries in the world, they're not perfect. They make mistakes. And those mistakes can have devastating consequences.
Okay, so in Turkey, there might be a glimmer of hope for peace. Abdullah Öcalan, the PKK leader who's been in prison for years, he's called for an end to the armed struggle.
Wow, okay. That's significant. He's a very influential figure.
Yeah, if he's serious about this, it could be a real turning point. But it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of trust building on both sides.
For sure. I mean, the conflict has been going on for so long. There's so much pain and mistrust.
It's a long road to peace. Unfortunately, not all the news is good. Thailand has deported dozens of Uyghurs to China.
Ugh, that's awful.
Yeah. And this was despite warnings from human rights groups who said those people could face persecution, even torture if they were sent back.
It's a complete disregard for human rights. And it's a sad reminder that for a lot of governments, politics, and self-interest, they come before compassion, before basic decency.
It's a shame. Okay, so in India, there's been this analysis of the court decisions related to those riots in Delhi back in 2020. And the results are pretty shocking. Apparently, over 80% of those cases have ended in acquittals or discharges.
Wow. So basically, most of the people accused of crimes during those riots, they've walked free.
Yeah. And it's raising serious concerns about whether justice is actually being served. I mean, those riots were incredibly violent. They left a lot of people traumatized. And if the perpetrators aren't held accountable, it perpetuates the cycle of violence and distrust.
Totally agree. There needs to be a thorough investigation, a real effort to get to the truth and to hold those responsible accountable. Otherwise, those wounds are never going to heal.
Okay, so this next story is, well, it's potentially a big deal for the war in Ukraine. Intelligence reports are saying that North Korea has sent more troops to help Russia.
Okay, wow. So they're upping their involvement.
Yeah, it seems that way. And it's a violation of international sanctions, of course.
Yeah.
But it also shows how this conflict is pulling in more and more actors, how it's becoming this global proxy war.
And it's worrying, right? Because North Korea is a nuclear power. And the more involved they get, the higher the stakes become.
For sure.
Okay, and some sad news from the entertainment world. Actress Michelle Trachtenberg has died.
Yeah, too young. She was only 39.
She was great in Buffy and in Gossip Girl. A lot of people are going to miss her.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that, life is precious and that we should cherish every moment. It's been a day, hasn't it? Full of, I don't know, full of everything, the good, the bad, the ugly. It's enough to make your head spin.
It really is, but I think it's important to remember that even in the midst of all this chaos, all this darkness, there's still good in the world. There are people working to make things better, to fight for justice, for peace, for a more compassionate world. We can't lose sight of that.
Absolutely. And that's what we try to do here, right? To shine a light on the important stories, to help people understand the world around them.
Exactly.
Well, thanks for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow with more news and analysis.
Until then, stay curious and stay informed.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to circle back to that whole Trump-Zelensky thing one more time. It feels like, I don't know, like a real turning point, not just for the U.S. and Ukraine, but for the whole world,
Yeah, it's like all the problems that have been building up for years, they all just kind of exploded with that one meeting. Trump's America First thing, how he just throws away those old alliances, how he treats foreign policy like it's a business deal. I mean, it all came crashing down, and it wasn't pretty.
And now you've got all these European leaders, they're trying to, reassure Zelensky. They're basically trying to fill the gap that America's left.
It's like they're watching a train wreck in slow motion. They've been warning about this for years, about the dangers of Trump's foreign policy, and now it's all coming true.
And this isn't just about Ukraine, right? It's like a taste of what's to come. What's he going to do about climate change, about nuclear weapons, about China getting more powerful?
Exactly. It makes you wonder, what happens to the world order if America's not the one in charge anymore? Can Europe step up? Or are we headed for a world where it's just, like, every country for itself? A world where the strongest ones make the rules and everyone else has to follow along.
It's a scary thought.
It is. But amidst all this big picture stuff, the politics and the power struggles, we can't forget about the human cost. The deaths of Gene Hackman and his wife, the migrant boat sinking, the Taliban spying on everyone. These aren't just headlines. They're about real people whose lives are being turned upside down.
It's easy to get lost in the abstract stuff, the ideologies, the strategies, but we have to remember that there are real people suffering, real people who are hurting.
That's what we try to do here, right? To tell those stories, to connect them to the bigger picture, to make it all feel real.
Well, we've covered a lot today. A lot to think about, that's for sure.
It's a lot to process, but that's the world we live in. It's
Yeah.
complicated, it's messy, and it's constantly changing.
Yeah. But even with all the bad news, it's important to remember that there's still good in the world. People fighting for what's right, people helping each other, people trying to make things better.
We can't give up hope.
Exactly. We got to keep fighting for a better future.
Well, that's it for us today. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from around the world.
Until then, stay curious and stay informed.